I wanted to start, though, with just a little bit about the current situation, or the situation in the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And that is, that's not what I'm showing you. This ad here, I found it from 1982. What I'm commenting here is that the current economic situation is rather different from 1982. And one sign of that is you don't see these ads anymore. I was just thinking, where are the ads for savings accounts? There used to be all the time in newspapers and magazines and TV. So I couldn't remember what they looked like, so I looked it up. I found this ad. And this is one you'd love to see today, but you won't see today. So this is offering a Passbook Plus account with a 7.4 per annum interest rate. Now, so do you even know what a Passbook savings account is? They used to, actually I have my passport here, I think. No, I don't, it's in my other. It looks like a passport. You used to walk into banks. Everything has changed so much. You used to walk in and there would be a teller and you would present your passbook. And you'd either deposit or withdraw. And they would enter your new balance in your passbook. And it's like a saving. Whenever you need money, you go right to the bank and you pull it out. Meanwhile, you're earning 7.4% a year interest on it. So this actually is an ad for somebody's Passbook Plus savings account, which has a term. It says this in the fine print. Stated term is 3 months. That means you technically, they might not let you, they might make you wait 3 months to get your money out. However, this is very similar to a passbook account because you make deposits and withdrawals without penalty or loss of earnings. So in this case, though, you have to keep your remaining balance at least $1,500. So here you are. You can go in and out of this account whenever you like. So it's basically an overnight account. You can take it out any day, any hour. It pays a nice interest rate, and it's insured by the government. So there's absolutely no risk. So this is what you want, right? Well, you're not going to get it because it doesn't exist anymore. Now, the secret is if you want something like this, you're going to have to pay a negative interest rate because it just doesn't pay. This business just doesn't pay because interest rates at the short end have gotten very low. Now, I'm going to come back to this. We're talking about the term structure. The term of any contract is the time that you have to keep your money in it and can't get it out. So this one is technically a 3-month term, but they're saying, trust us, you can get it out anytime. So it's basically overnight. Absolutely no penalty for withdrawing, it says. We are in a situation in which at the short term, interest rates are virtually zero. It's a historic event. And so when I'm going to talk about interest rates, we might wonder why these things are happening. So this is the federal funds rate. Now I'm mentioning term. Term is the time that you have to leave your money in and cannot get it out, at least without a penalty. So this is the shortest term interest rate in the United States. It's called the federal funds rate, and it's an overnight rate. Now, most of the people who deal in this maturity of one day are banks, because individuals normally don't borrow money overnight. It's too short an interval. Only people who with very sharp pencils and very professional would borrow money for one day. But it's a lively market, largely among bankers. So this is the interest rate on federal funds in the United States from 1954 to the present. So the ad that I showed you was from somewhere around here. I picked a high interest rate time looking for an ad. Those were different times. Look where we are now. Okay, this is amazing. It's right at zero. And it's been at zero ever since the crisis. Now, it's going to pick up. In fact, it's already picking up. Do you see this little uptick at the end? That was the decision of the government, the U.S. the Federal Reserve under Janet Yellen, to raise interest rates. And it got a lot of attention. But I'll have to say I'm not very impressed by this raise of interest rates because it's virtually zero still. So something funny is going on here, wouldn't you say? If you looked at this whole, if your job was to predict interest rates, and you were standing here in, say, 2004, would you have predicted this? Well, absolutely no one. I shouldn't say. There might have been someone who predicted this, but as far as I know, no one saw this coming. So something very strange is happening. It'd be nice to understand this interest rate market. Now, you might first of all say that, well, this is a targeted interest rate. The Federal Reserve announces a federal funds rate target, and they do everything they can, and they've decided to put it at virtually zero. So you have to understand the Fed. But maybe you don't have to understand Janet Yellen or Ben Bernanke, because these are the chairs of the Federal Reserve. Because anyone would do the same thing. It's an economic crisis that's brought equilibrium short-term interest rates down to zero. And to give you an idea that it is an economic crisis and it's not the personality of Janet Yellen that accounts for this behavior, let's look at Europe. So this is the European counterpart to the federal funds rate. It's called EONIA, European Overnight Index Average. So it's the same thing. Banks in Europe lend to each other overnight, and this is the interest rate. Now this only goes, I got these data from the European Central Bank, and so that's why it only goes back to 1999. But you can see that it has the same downward path since 2000, right? Now it's even more interesting because in the US it stopped at zero. But hey, it somehow knows no zero bound. In fact, it's been negative for over a year. And it just seems to be trending down. Is this going to, what is it, now if I asked you to forecast where it will be in 10 years, where will EONIA be in 10 years? Well, you might be inclined to forecast, oh, I don't know, -3%. Does anyone believe that? Anyone offer a forecast? What do you think it will be? It can't go too far negative because the banks have the option of just holding on to cash. Why should you lend money at a negative interest rate? Well, that's an interesting question. You can blame Mario Draghi, who's head of the European Central Bank, he and the others at the bank have lowered the interest rate that they offer to European banks on deposits at the European Central Bank to a negative number. So that you could say it was the decision of the central bank. But still, it seems odd. Why does a bank ever invest money at a negative rate when they can just pull the money out and hold cash? Cash, by definition, I mean real cash, paper money, those euro notes that you have in your pocket, they pay exactly zero interest. So why would a bank lend to another bank at negative? Does anyone have an idea? Why would they are doing it, right? We know they're doing it. Why are they lending to another bank at a negative rate? It's costly to store cash. First of all, if it becomes known that you have large amounts of cash in your vault, thieves might come and steal it. So you'd have to buy insurance against that, and then the insurance company will impose costs on you. Plus, you have to hire those trucks to drive it. You know, it's not set up. Banks don't hold huge amounts of cash in their vaults. So, yeah, so you've got to hire trucks and armed guards, and it sounds, I think also it's just irregular. We don't do this. We don't have, billions in our vault. We have to get a bigger vault, maybe, because they don't. What's the biggest euro note? It's probably like 100. Does anyone know? 500. Oh, is it 500? Okay, in the United States, it's only $100. So to store $1 billion, you need a big vault. So you have to buy a new vault. It's silly things like that that allow negative interest rates. I think that as they learn, that it's going to be harder to have a negative. So right now it looks like, in this latest data shown here, it looks like about minus 30 basis points, where a basis point is 1/100th of a percentage point. So it's minus 1/3 of a percent. So they can get it lower than that for a while anyway. But anyway, it's just trying to understand, why did it get so low? So this brings us to causes of interest rates. There was a famous book written by Eugen von Boehm-Bawerk in 1884, Capital and Interest, which said interest rates tend to be small positive numbers, like 3% or 5%, because of technical progress, time preferences, and advantages to roundaboutness. I think he said he wrote in German, so how do you say roundaboutness in German? It's not exactly an English word either. I'll let you think about that. But it's probably a translation of some long German word. But he said, where do these numbers 3% come from? Why is it 3% or 5%? Well, he said, it's because the rate of progress is something like 3%. Also, so that sounds plausible, right? The economy is moving forward. So money, one dollar today is really, if you take into account what will happen to the economy, it's really like $1.03 in a year. The other thing is time preferences. He said people are just naturally impatient. It's built into our, well, I don't think he said built into our neurostructure, but maybe he meant that. So, so we just want more today. So if $1.03 in a year is equivalent to $1 today, because I prefer it now. And so I'll take a cut in what I have to get it now rather than later. And finally, advantages to roundaboutness. That is, advantages to more delayed and complicated production process. So for example, I'll just give you a very homely example. I can talk to an apple orchard and say, how many apples can you give me today? And so the guy quotes so many bushels of apples. And then you come back and say, that's not enough. I want more apples. And he'll say, hey, our trees only produce so much. But you say, I want more. And then he said, well, okay, what I'll do, instead of giving you apples now, I will sell my apples, buy fertilizer, and I'll get stronger and bigger trees next year, and I'll have more for you. But it's more roundabout, right? I'm converting apples into fertilizer, and I'm making the trees bigger. I can get you more next year. That's a roundabout production process. And so there's an advantage to that. So all three of those were causes of interest.
Do you think that low interest rates are contributing to inequality?
There's definitely some connection, because a lot of elderly people retire on fixed incomes. And if they have a rule that they will only consume the interest, and the interest is zero, they're in big trouble. And that is unfortunately the situation. It's unfortunate that our efforts at policy can't help everybody. So monetary policy is a very blunt tool. You may feel that you have to cut interest rates to help the economy move ahead, but it doesn't affect everyone the same. And that, anytime it doesn't, that has a potential to raise inequality. Now I wanted to give you a lesson which I somehow have the impression you learned in high school. Did you learn a compound interest? It's supposed to be such a basic math point, but let me just reiterate it. Suppose there's an annual rate of interest R, and suppose that you're putting your money in a savings account in a bank that promises to compound once per year. What does that mean? That means that your interest is applied to the account once a year, and you start earning interest on your interest at the end of the year. So if I put $100 into an account paying 3%, compounding once a year, and I go to the bank after 6 months and I say, I'd like to cash out of my account, what's it worth? They would say $100 because we haven't credited your annual interest yet. So then you go, if you wait a full year, you can come back to the bank and now you get $103. Now your account is marked up for compounding. If you go back to the bank in 18 months since you deposited it and you ask for your money, they'd say, well, now you have $103 because we haven't credited your new interest for this year. You have to wait 2 years, and after 2 years, how much do you have? You have 1.03 times $1.03. It's a little over $1.06 if you have annual compounding. Now the banks often compound more often than once a year. So suppose they compound twice per year. You put in $100 in a 3% account, compounding twice per year. You would get, if you went to get your money out in the first 6 months, you would still just get $100 back. After 6 months, you'd get $101.50. If you went back after 9 months, you'd get $101.50. You'd have to wait 2 years, no, 1 full year. Did I say that right? Not, yeah. You have to wait a full year, and then you would get 1.015 squared times $100. You see where we're going on this. If it's compounded twice per year, the balance is 1 plus r over 2 times 2t after t years, where t is any number which is either 1 or 1 plus, or it is either an integer or an integer plus a half. In between, it's a step function. And if it's compounded n times a year, the balance is 1 plus r over n to the nt period. Now, if you take the limit of this expression as n goes to infinity, you get what's called continuous compounding. And then the balance is e to the rt, where e is the natural number. So if they continuously compound, it improves your interest payments a little bit more. But unless r is really big, it's not, or t is really big, it's not a huge difference. Now I want to define a discount bond. Bonds typically pay coupons. This is an old word, but they still say coupons. It used to be that if you invested in a corporate bond or a government bond, it would be on a piece of paper they would give you. This is like for hundreds of years. And around the exterior of the pieces of paper were little coupons that you would clip every 6 months, typically. And you would clip your coupons every 6 months and take them to a bank, and the bank would then give you the money. So each coupon would be so much money. And then at the end of the maturity of the bond, you could take the whole thing back and you get your amount back. So a typical bond back then would say sell for, back then, I mean in 1900 and 1800 and 1700, going way back. If you bought a $100 bond and it was issued for $100 and had, say, a $3 coupon, then you would pay $100. You'd wait 6 months. You'd clip a coupon, and it would say, pay to the bearer $1.50. You'd go to the bank and get your $1.50. You can see some of these bonds. They're framed and on display. Ones that defaulted. Otherwise, the coupons would be already clipped and gone. You can see them. I think they're on display up on the 4th floor of this building. But a discount bond is a bond that carries no coupon. Now, why would you buy a bond that carries no coupon? Because how do you get interest from it? This is also time immemorial. People have traded discount bonds for a long time, and the answer is because you buy it for less than $100. You buy it at a discount. So there tend to be 2 different kinds of bonds. The coupon bonds, which are more common, tend to be sold at par. You buy it initially for $100 and you sell it for $100. You get it back at the end when it matures after so many predefined years. With a discount bond, there are no coupons, but of course you buy it at a discount. There'd be no other reason to buy it unless it was, well, there'd be, maybe today they're selling not at a discount with our negative interest rates, but normally they're sold at a discount. We still call them discount bonds even if there's a negative interest rate, then they're selling for more than $100 initially. So if we look at the price of the discount bond, we can infer the yield to maturity from that bond. So if someone says, I have a bond that will pay, well, let's say $1 in T years, then and it's compounding once a year, then I would say, if it's, and the price I want is P, I can compute using this formula what the yield to maturity is. So I would basically take 1 over P, solving this equation, I'd take 1 over P to the 1 over T power, and that's the yield to maturity. It's, in a sense, paying an interest rate of R every year, compounding once a year, if I call it that. Typically, bonds pay interest rate every 6 months. That's a tradition. So you might use this formula instead, which has the bond compounding twice a year. If T is the number of years to maturity and P is the price, then we will take P as the present value of the principal, which I have as $1 here, divided by 1 plus R over 2 to the 2T. So this is called, the price today of the bond is called the present value, if it's a $1 principal, of $1 at time capital T. And as a general rule, P is going to be less than 1. I say as a general rule because it might not hold right now, which is a little puzzling. But over most of history, it's a discount. P is less than 1. So is that clear? Any questions about that? You have to specify the compounding interval. But normally, for pedagogical purposes, it's convenient to take the compounding as once a year. And we just use this formula. By the way, you could do it continuously, too. You could say, what is the continuously compounded yield to maturity? And that would, you would have P equals e to the minus R times capital T. Okay. Now we can define the present discounted value of any cash flow, not just a coupon flow, which would be the case for a coupon bond, or the principal after T years for a discount bond. Because we know that implicit in market prices for discount bonds, we can calculate the present discounted value of $1 in any number of years. So what is $1 1 year today? What is the present discounted value of that? It's 1 over 1 plus R, where R is the yield to maturity on a 1-year discount bond. And what is the present discounted value of $1 in n years? It's 1 over 1 plus R to the nth power. Now this is obvious to a banker who always thinks, when you talk money with a banker and you talk about money in future years, there's a little calculator going in his head. He has memorized the prices of all these discount bonds going out, and he's translating it into present value, or present discounted value, PDV. Amateurs mess this up, and so they become vulnerable to phishes. Lots of people make mistakes. Maybe you should develop the habit of always computing the present discounted value. On the other hand, you live at a very good time for ignoring this, because right now interest rates are virtually zero. So, but it will come back. I think, Nick, you are right. We're going to have 2% and higher interest rates at some date in the future. I just don't know when. If you have a cash flow, x sub t, where so x sub 1 is the money coming in 1 year, x sub 2 is the money coming in 2 years. And let's assume that the discount rate is the same for all these different maturities, which is a simplification. Then the present discounted value of the cash flow is the summation t equals 1 to capital T of the cash flow x sub t divided by 1 plus r to the t. That's one of the most famous formulas in finance. So now let's look at a conventional coupon-varying bond, which is issued at par. Now, how do they issue them at par, by the way? It's tradition to issue at par because you're getting your interest in the form of coupons. What they have to do is judge the market. What coupon is the market? If I want to issue at par, what coupon is the market demanding on $100? And once I know that, I'll just pick that coupon, and I can be pretty sure that my bond will be picked up for $100 because I've got the market coupon. So I'm going to use C for the amount of coupon. Now this is measured in currency. If we're dealing in dollars, C is so many dollars, and the price is in so many dollars. And what it is now, now here I have it two versions. This is compounded annually, and this is the more realistic compounded every 6 months, where T measures years. So what you get in this simple case, when you buy a coupon bond, is you get, after 1 year, this is the annual compounding, after 1 year, I can clip a coupon for R dollars, not R, for C dollars. And then I have to wait another year, and then I can clip a coupon for C dollars again, and clip another coupon in 3 years for C dollars. What's the present value of, and then at the end, I get my last coupon of C dollars plus the principal, which is 100. So I get 100 plus C dollars at the end. What is the present value of that if it's discounted at rate R? It turns out that's the formula for the present value. Now it's interesting to take the limit of this as t goes to infinity. If t goes to infinity, this term goes to 0, right? And this term goes to 0. So we're left with c times 1 over r. So that's the console. Yeah, I think I have another slide for that. This is the more complicated formula for 6-month compounding. This formula was sufficiently difficult that in the old days, and people didn't have calculators, bankers would carry around a table, a bond yield table. Also, you can't solve this back. If I'm told the price of a bond and I want to compute the yield to maturity R, I've got to solve this equation for R. And you can't. It's not algebraically possible unless t is very small. So you need a book. But now it's probably already on your mobile phone. I think it is. I know it is. You can get this on your, go to Wolfram Alpha on your mobile phone and you'll get, or there must be other places. Must be hundreds of places that will solve this equation for you because it's standard. So many people think in terms of present values and they want to know what the yield to maturity, what's the interest rate on a bond given its price. So I already mentioned a console is one that pays a quantity. Well, I was saying C or whatever, X forever. And the console present discounted value is X over, or coupon over R. So it's kind of obvious in the case of why do we call them consoles, by the way? Because in Britain in the 1700s, the government of the United Kingdom issued bonds with no maturity date. They promised to pay this coupon forever. And the only way they could get out of it was by buying them back. And those bonds, well, there were some adjustments made in the 1880s. They're still paying the coupon. The British government hasn't defaulted in all that time. And so it's not forever, but it's close to forever. I mean, several hundred years. It's a long time to be paying a coupon. Now, it's simple to understand the console present. It says the price of the console, P, is equal to C over R. You can just return it around, it says the yield to maturity on a console is C over P. And that's kind of obvious, right? What interest, if the console is paying a £3 coupon and it's selling for $200, 200 pounds, I say, what is the yield to maturity on it? Well, it's 3 pounds divided by 200 pounds. In that case, it would be, if it was 3% yield to maturity, it'd be, I'm sorry, if it was a 3% coupon at issue, it's now paying 1.5% yield to maturity because the price has gone up. And this is an important point with bonds. The coupon is fixed at the time the bond is issued, but the market price of the bond changes through time. So if the British government issued a £3 console for 100 pounds, and that console is selling for 200 pounds today, the yield to maturity is down to 1.5% instead of 3%. But this is no fault of the British government. They're true to their word. They're paying the console as promised. It's the market that does it. So bonds are risky. They have market risk, even if there's no default risk. If you buy a console, you know you won't live forever. The British government may live forever, but you won't. So you're going to want to sell the coupon at some point. The British government does not guarantee the rate that you will get, the price you'll get for selling your console. So there's market risk for a console, and for any debt instrument, long-term debt instrument. By the way, if a bank or a company or a government were to issue usually companies don't issue consoles because nobody believes they'll last forever. Patriots in Britain might believe that the British government will last forever, although I can tell you it won't. Not forever. Nothing is forever. But they imagine it's forever, so they're willing to buy British consoles. But what if the British government did something even more dramatic? They say, we're going to have the coupon on the console growing at a constant rate. So it's going to start out at 3 pounds, and then it's going to grow at a rate G per year. G is a percent of growth per year forever. Well, what is the present value of an amount X if the rate is the yield to maturity or interest rate is R, and the X is going to grow at rate G? Well, it turns out the growing console present discounted value is X over R minus G. So by the way, what happens if G is greater than R? Or G equals R? Any idea on that? Well, I think you probably can figure this out. If G equals R, it's X divided by 0. It's infinite. That's because it's the series that you're summing is not convergent. If you're getting this, an amount that's growing at the rate of interest, the present value is infinite. And if it's growing at greater than the rate of interest, well, the formula breaks down. It's still infinite. So that's why we get puzzled about the present situation. If the interest rate is 0, then consoles don't even converge. How can that be? Doesn't the interest rate always have to be above the growth rate? How can anything, nothing can have an infinite price. Well, I guess the answer is short-term interest rates are 0, but longer-term interest rates are still positive. So, we don't have many, the US doesn't have consoles, but we have something analogous to consoles, like land, for example. That lasts forever, as far as we know. It pays, you can rent it out or you can plant crops on it, as far as we know, forever. Maybe those what about land? Aren't crop values rising through time? So that G is a positive number? And if interest rates they can't be 0. They have to be, long rates have to be above 0. Otherwise, assets that have growing payments would be worth an infinite amount. Now, this is an annuity present discounted value. Now, an annuity is like a console, except that it stops after a certain number of years. In a typical annuity, a typical annuity is a home mortgage. When you buy a house, the typical financing you'll get is that you will pay, now the compounding interval is monthly. They think it's not realistic to ask ordinary people to pay their mortgage every 6 months because it's too hard for them. They wouldn't remember to save and they wouldn't have enough money to pay it after 6 months. So we got to move to a monthly schedule for individuals. So a typical, this is not compounding monthly, but this is the present value of X dollars every year, starting in 1 year, and then again in 2 years, then again in 3 years, and the last payment is T years. This is different from the present value for a corporate bond or for a coupon-carrying bond because there's no principal repayment at the end. I'm talking about, I think I have another slide on mortgages. I'll come back to that. But I'll tell you, realistically, these financial instruments are designed around human imperfections. People find it difficult to pay back a mortgage. And what they'll find especially difficult is to pay a balloon payment at the end. They call it a balloon payment. There used to be mortgages like this. You would borrow to buy your house. You'd pay, say, I'm going back to the 1920s. The house cost $10,000, typical house in the 1920s. You borrowed $9,000. You've got your own money to put up. The $9,000, then you pay back the money at a rate interest. But at the end, you don't owe anything except the last monthly payment. So that's what an annuity is. This is a little history of thought. The growing console formula has been called the Gordon rule, according to Myron Gordon, who was a professor of economics about a half century ago. But actually, it goes back to Jacob Bernoulli. I learned that from Will Getzman and his co-author Gert Rowenhurst here. So it's an old formula. Forward rates are interest rates that can be taken in advance using the term structure. I was writing an article about the term structure of interest rates, and I was wondering who invented the concept of forward rates. And I couldn't figure it out. It's hard to find the first, especially back when I was writing when we didn't have the internet. And I asked a graduate student, can you find out who invented the concept of forward rate? I think it's Sir John Hicks. So my graduate student went to the library, the way we used to do these things, and tried to find out. Then he came back to me and he said, you know, Sir John Hicks is still alive. You could ask him. So I thought, I never thought of that. Is he still alive? And so this was back, I don't know, like 1980 or something. So I thought, all right, I'll find his address and I'll mail him a letter. So I typed a letter to him saying, did you invent the concept of forward rates? And I waited about 6 months, and then I get a letter back, handwritten, with shaky handwriting, and Sir John Hicks said, interesting question, did I invent that concept? He had shaky handwriting. He said, I apologize, my health is not good anymore, but I thought I would answer your question. So he went back and he said, well, I thought it was in my wife and I did a translation around 1920 of a book by a Swedish economist, and I thought it was there, but I went, and it's not there. And then he says, he reminisced about conversations he had at coffee hour at the London School of Economics in the 1920s, and he said, well, maybe somebody brought this up, but I don't know. Maybe I did invent it. So I put my example here at the coffee hour at the London School of Economics. The year is 1925. This assumes that he got it from some verbal conversation, but nobody knows. He's long gone now. We can't ask him again. So here we are sitting at the London School of Economics in 1925, and somebody is saying, you know, I'm wondering what interest rates I could invest money at in 1926. That's next year. Remember, you've got to put yourself back in a time machine here. So the year is 1925. And you want to invest the money between 1926 and 1927. And he's saying, I just wonder what interest rate I can get in 1926. That's a year in the future. Then apparently somebody, maybe it was Sir John Hicks at the coffee hour, said, that's a dumb question. Maybe he wasn't so rude. He said, I can get it today. I can lock it in today. And this is 1925, but there's already an interest rate between 1926 and 1927. So we'll call that the forward rate. But that term hadn't been invented. It's amazing how simple concepts don't seem to be known until somebody points them out aggressively. So this is the coffee hour conversation as I'm reconstructing it. This is how you do it. How do I lock in an interest rate as an investor from 1926 to 1927? I buy in 1925 this number of two-period discount bonds maturing at 100 pounds in 1927. They're two-year bonds, okay? The cost, okay, so I'm buying this number of them. So if I'm buying this number of them, the cost to me is 1 pound over 1 plus R1. And then I have to short in 1925 one period discount bond maturing at $100 in 1926. So I receive 1 over 1 plus R1 pounds. Now think about it. I have locked in an interest rate equal, we'll call it 1 plus F, which is equal to 1 plus this two-period yield to maturity squared all over 1 plus the one-period yield to maturity. And I've locked it in. So this was kind of a showstopper at the coffee hour at the LSE in 1925. This guy thought he was answering an unanswerable question. And here it is. It's in, so that you could pick up today's copy of the London Times, and these prices of discount bonds will be listed. I can tell you exactly what the market today is quoting for the 1926 to 1927 investment. So is that clear? It's a little tricky. I guess nobody thought to talk in those terms until then. I was doing the introduction for the John Bates Clark Medal at the American Economic Association, and I was telling our own members at the AEA, what did John Bates Clark do that is most distinctive? In 1895, he wrote a journal article defining what he called the real interest rate. What it is the interest rate corrected for inflation. Now, I did a search to see if anyone knew of real interest rates before 1895, and I got hits in 1894 and 1893, but nothing before that. So I think it was John Bates Clark who invented the idea. It's just amazing to me that people didn't understand forward rates, they didn't understand real rates. To me, they seem like just such natural concepts. So the nominal interest rate, what we've been talking about now, is quoted in currency, dollars, pounds, renminbi, whatever. But it's not corrected for inflation. And as you know, when you have inflation, the value of the currency declines. The real rate is quoted in terms of the market basket that underlies the price index, consumer price index. So just in simple terms, if you are investing money at 3% for next year, and the inflation rate, consumer price index, is going up at 3%, what is your real rate? How much are you making in real terms? Well, it's kind of obvious. It's zero, right? If I have $3 more on my $100 investment, but everything that I want to buy has gone up by 3%, then I have the same buying power, so I didn't get anything. So the simple way of describing it is usually the real rate, this is simplified, the real rate equals the nominal rate minus the rate of inflation. But actually the formula is more like this. 1 plus the nominal rate or money rate equals 1 plus, plus the real rate times 1 plus the rate of inflation. This is an approximation. If you multiply this through, you'll see that it's missing the cross product term, the product of money times our money times I, which is close to 0. Another really important invention in history is the invention of index bonds, which are bonds that pay coupons defined in real terms and a principal, or one or the other, in real terms. In 1780, I'm attributing this idea to Paul Revere, but I don't know, it probably wasn't his idea. But he engraved the bonds, the first issue of an index bond. I bought one. Under Will Getzman's influence, I discovered I could buy one of these bonds. It only cost me $1,000. I have it up, and it's framed in my office if you want to come back and see it. Engraved by Paul Revere. That's pretty neat. But what's even neater about it was a clever idea. Let's issue bonds whose coupons are just tied to the inflation rate so that you know in real terms what you're getting. The U.S. Treasury did not follow up on Massachusetts until 1997. So that's 217-year lag between the first issue of index bonds in the United States and the second. Well, there might have been some minor issues somewhere in between, but basically that's what happened. So they were called TIPS. They still are, Treasury Inflation Protection Securities. They were issued in 1997. By 2006, they were 7% of the national debt. I should update this. They went up more by 2010 or so. I think they're down now, but they're still big. In the UK, they call them index-linked gilts. They're bigger in the UK. By 2006, they were 25% of the UK national debt. And France and other countries have been issuing them. They're still a little controversial, but they make great sense to me. If a company or an individual borrows money to buy assets, we say that person is leveraging, or company is leveraging. Leveraging means you're putting more money into the asset than you have. You could buy, if you have $100 to invest, you could buy $100 of stocks, or you could buy $200 of stocks and borrow $100. That makes you at a riskier situation, but also both up and down. So if you bought $100 worth of stocks and you're lucky and it doubles in value to $200, you've made $100. But if you leveraged and the stock doubles in value, your portfolio goes from 200 minus 100 to 400 minus 100, or $300. So you double your profits. But on the other side of it is if the stock falls in value. Suppose you bought it unleveraged, you bought $100 worth of stock, and it falls in value by 50%, then you're down to $50. You've lost 50. But if you leveraged and you bought $200 worth of stock and borrowed $100, then if it falls by 50%, you're wiped out. So leveraging increases risks. People look at how leveraged economies are and wonder about the chaos that might ensue in a market correction. For example, China is widely described as a highly leveraged country. It's gotten worse after the financial crisis. There was a Wall Street Journal article just the other day pointing out that corporate debt, borrowing by corporations in China is 160% of GDP in China, whereas in the US it's only 70%. So that means the Chinese economy is leveraged, and it could do very well as a leveraged economy, but it's more vulnerable, and this is a concern. So debt leads to bankruptcy. If you have no debt, you normally don't go bankrupt. Because bankruptcy occurs when your creditors are after you for non-payment, and normally you would just pay them if you had the money. It's just when you don't have the money that you are in trouble. Now, I think a very important, I keep coming back to Irving Fisher. As I say, I'm a little bit biased because he's a Yale person, but I never even met the guy, and I don't know if I would like him. He's kind of a quirky guy. He would invite students over for dinner at his house, and he would tell them at dinner, you have to chew each bite 100 times before you swallow. because he thought that was health. Anyone do that? Anyone be careful to chew your food well? So it must have been a little bit odd having dinner with Irving Fisher. But he was a brilliant economist, and he wrote an article in 1933 in Econometrica called the debt deflation model of Great Depressions. In 1933, prices were falling at a rapid rate because of the Depression. We had huge deflation. And he thought, maybe that's why we're having the Depression. And here's his train of thought as he describes it there. Normally, people who borrow money are the optimists, right? They're borrowing, they're leveraging. They think the stock market will go up or some other market will go up, and they want to get it. And they're willing to take risks. So you have the risk-taking optimists on one side. And then you have the naysayers, the people who are pessimistic and risk-averse, and they don't want to take chances, as the lenders. So what happens when there's a huge deflation and consumer price index goes down? Well, that magnifies the real value of the debt, right? If the consumer price index, if you owe $100 and the consumer price index falls by 25%, your debt has gone up to, 133? It's gone up a lot. What ends up happening in a deflation is that the debtors get beaten down. The optimists have less wealth in real terms, and the pessimists have more, because now the $100 that they loaned is worth a lot more. So he thought, this has to be important. You know that people are different. Some people are natural optimists, and some people are just, not necessarily that they're just pessimistic, but they just don't want to get into that. They don't want to, they're not entrepreneurial, they're not, I don't mean that disparagingly, they're just a different personality. Maybe they're artistic or something else. But then in a depression, wealth gets distributed toward them, so in a weighted sense, like they get more votes now. So you've now rewarded the pessimists, and the world is being run by the pessimists. So no wonder we're in a depression in 1933. Now the recent crisis, that is of 2008-9, it's not quite so recent anymore, but it's still with us, did not bring much deflation, not like 1933. But what it did do is it produced lower consumer prices than people expected, because inflation often practically disappeared, and there was some deflation at times. So that means that relative to expectations, wealth had been redistributed from those who borrowed money to those who lent money. So it's still true, and it may be an important factor to consider. This brings up a question that I've already alluded to. Why isn't debt indexed to inflation? Well, it isn't. I think this is a puzzling thing about human nature. People just don't get it. And it happens again and again that we have major shifts in the price level, and it redistributes debt value between debtors and creditors. And people just don't get it. I think they're afraid of index numbers. It's calculations. The consumer price index is some calculation. Or you want my debt to be tied to a formula. So anyway, I've already alluded to the fact that I think we should create an indexed unit of account like they have in Chile or Mexico or some other countries, so that it would be easier for people to contemplate indexation. But they don't. This is the real world. So anytime we see unexpected behavior of consumer prices, it has real effects on the economy. John Akopoulos here at Yale has written a number of papers on what he calls the leverage cycle, and pointing out that leverage has varied quite a bit through time. Notably, recently in the United States, just before in 2006, just before the financial crisis, leverage became extremely high, particularly in the housing market. Banks were allowing people to borrow typically something like 97% of the value of the house to borrow a house. So this leverage, you think anyone who takes a risky investment and borrows 97% of the money, that's really a daring thing to do. But everyone was doing that. Anyone who was in that stage of the life cycle where you would buy a house, it's funny how people value, I don't think that people are consistent at all in their thinking about risk. A view developed in 2006 that housing prices are going up, I say before 2006, housing prices are going up so fast, you can make a lot of money by, in fact, you could make a huge amount of money, percentage-wise, by just buying a house. If you bought a house in 2000, home prices went up, well, I shouldn't have this memorized, but let's say they went up 50% after that. You make 50% on your investment, it's pretty good. But if you borrow 97% of the money, it's just astronomical what you could make. People got excited about leverage because they also had the perception that home prices don't fall. I know this was out there. People had this idea. Why do they think home prices don't fall? Is there some law of economics? House prices never fall? Well, we know the law is wrong because in 1933 they were falling rapidly. And so I guess that's beyond people's memories. So people got kind of an optimistic bias just before the financial crisis. And the economy leveraged itself up. It isn't the government that did it. The government, if anything, was leaning against that with regulations. So anyway, so that's the end of my thoughts. So is debt immoral? I tend not to think of it at all as immoral. We talked about the Irving-Fisher diagram, how the ability to borrow and lend raises utility. I think of it at various times in life. You need money. The extreme case is you need money for illness. You're sick. You're going to die. You need expensive treatment. And then you live. Of course you borrow the money. So lenders are not evil. Even if they lend, we talked about this, even if they lend for your honeymoon, for a vacation, that's not evil either. You may know psychologically your fiancé needs that. You want the marriage to succeed, and there's just something you have to do. It's not crazy. It's not self-indulgent. So I think debt is a good thing, but not always well managed. Now, we did not invent stocks in the United States of America, but I just started out by, I wanted to show market capitalization. Remember, we defined the market capitalization is the price per share multiplied by the number of shares. And this is common stock. I'll define that in a minute. I just took some kind of the latest year I could get data. Shows the market cap in trillions of US dollars by country. Just for a random selection of countries that I picked. And here is the market cap as a percent of annual GDP. So the United States leads the pack. For now, I say the United States did not invent corporate stock, although it was here in the United States that a general limited liability law was invented. And that may be a head start that this country got to impetus toward huge stock market valuation. But as of 2014, the market capitalization of the US stock market was 26 trillion. Actually, it hasn't changed a whole lot since then because 2014 was a peak. 2015 was flat. 2016 is down so far. So it's something like that now. At 151% of GDP. No other country comes close. But I think if you put the EU together, I didn't do that, the European Union, it comes somewhat close. But I think here's one EU country. The stock market as a percent of GDP is lower than the US, but they have a very large GDP. Canada is a little bit less capitalist. See, we're really capitalists in this country. We have a big stock market. It's all traded. A lot of this isn't owned by Americans, by the way. The Chinese love the U.S. stock market, and they would invest in it more if there weren't regulations in China making that difficult. But America is for sale. But I should add, the U.S. stock market is not America. It's a particular thing. It's a particular contract. It's a claim on earnings of the corporate sector. And there's much more to this country, and to any country, than the stock market. So I don't want to overplay it. Okay, just to give another perspective, this is now about the United States. The Federal Reserve Board of Governors has a balance sheet for households and nonprofits. They lump in nonprofits with households, which I think is unfortunate, but they're small. It's basically households. So what's the total wealth? Tangible. We're eliminating. We're not including human capital. You could compute a present value of your lifetime income. For each of you, that would be in the many millions. I'm hoping. Not for each of you. Some of you won't do that, but most of you, because you'll live a long time and earn money for a long time. But what is the tangible assets that we can quantify and value through markets? According to the Federal Reserve, as of 2014, these assets were worth 98 trillion US dollars. Ask people to add up everything they own, their house, their stocks, their bonds, everything. Add that number for every household, and you get almost $100 trillion. But people don't own it free and clear. They have liabilities. For example, typically they borrowed money to buy the house, so they have debt. So we want to subtract off those liabilities. The total value of those liabilities in 2014 was 14 trillion. So that leaves the total net worth of households in the United States at 84 trillion. That's quite a bit more than the stock market. Now, corporate equities owned directly, now equities, that's the same as stock, or common stock. Households own directly 13.9 trillion. That's less than half of the stock market. They tended to own it in other forms, like mutual funds, which are, as of 2014, were almost 8 trillion. What are mutual funds? They are collections of investments made by an investment company who then sells shares to the public. Now this includes, I believe, other, not just corporate stocks, but also, it definitely includes bonds and other investments that mutual funds might make, but it's mostly stocks. And pension funds, 20.6 trillion. Those are investment companies that save for your retirement. Your employer typically gives you one. This is not Social Security. Social Security is a government pension fund, but companies also, as a compensation to their employees, give them pension funds, and the pension funds invest and typically buy stocks. Now, you'll note that these numbers add up to more than 26 trillion, which is my market cap for the stock market. But that's because pension funds also invest in bonds and other things. And then the balance sheet for the table B101 also includes the value of real estate owned directly by households. That's mostly single-family homes. But it also includes vacation homes. Some households have investment properties. So the total value of real estate owned by households, and I have to say in parentheses, and nonprofits, is 23.7 trillion. Bigger than the stock market. No, not quite. Bigger than the direct holdings on the stock market, about close to twice as big. So even in America, most people are not that into stock market investing. I think it might be very smart policy not to buy a home, to rent a home, and invest in a broadly diversified portfolio, which would be less risky. But most people don't do that. And maybe they have good reasons. So what is a stock? Well, we first have to think about the corporation. So the word corporation comes from the Latin word corpus, meaning body. And what it is an organization that is incorporated. That means it's made as if it has a body, as if it's a person. In fact, the word person in law typically includes corporations. If you wanted to say an individual, you could say a natural person. A corporation is an artificial person. The idea is to create something that legally has a lot of the rights that individuals do. And traditionally it would be created by a royal charter, prescription, or act of legislature. More recently, it's done according to procedures that are widely available. In ancient Rome, they had corporations. They were called publicani, but they were limited, and they had a stock market. This is what you can read in the Getzmann book. The stock market of ancient Rome was outdoors on the street in front of one of the temples in the Roman Forum, and you could go and buy shares in companies. There isn't much data left about stock prices then. Most of the companies, at least later in ancient Rome, were of a certain kind. They were tax collectors. The Roman government paid private companies to collect taxes for them. Why not, right? It's not the way we normally do things today. But rather than go out after everyone, the government just hired a company to do it. And those were traded on the stock exchange. But they didn't develop much, and I don't know the reason. They didn't have any insurance companies or shipping companies. Those kinds of activities were done without incorporation. Now let's talk about a modern corporation. The modern corporation in the United States, let's talk about a for-profit company like those that are on the New York Stock Exchange. It's governed by a board of directors that is elected by the shareholders. So it's called shareholder democracy. Typically, one share, one vote. So it sounds like a sensible thing. It's a little bit like the Electoral College in a U.S. Constitution for the government. You vote for electors, and then the electors vote for the president. Similarly, you, as a shareholder, vote your shares, one share, one vote in the company. It sounds sensible to elect a board of directors. And then the board of directors votes on who will be the president. The CEO or president, well, we now tend to say CEO, Chief Executive Officer. And companies will also have a president. But the CEO is generally the top person. So the CEO is hired by the board, serves as an employee, and has to report to the board of directors. Even nonprofits are somewhat like, they do have a board of directors, and then they hire the president. There are other structures. In Germany, notably, a company will have two boards, an Aufsichtsrat and a Vorstand. The Aufsichtsrat is a supervisory board which stands on top of the whole operation. The Vorstand does the details, manages, well, it doesn't actually do, it hires people to manage the company, but it's in charge of the day-to-day activities. But it's the same basic idea, they just divide it into two parts. Now, I've been talking about for-profit corporations. We also have non-profit corporations. A for-profit corporation is owned by the shareholders, and the shareholders have one vote each. The shareholders have the claim on the earnings of the company and have to pay a corporate profits tax. The company has to pay a tax to the government on its earnings. Non-profit corporations, for example, Yale University, are not owned by anyone. Now you might ask, how can that be? How can it not be owned by anyone. Well, they have a board of directors called the Yale Corporation, and they have a provision where alumni can elect them. Other nonprofits would just be not self-perpetuating. That is, the directors appoint their own successors. It sounds a little wild, because what if the directors get crazy? Then the whole thing could go down in craziness. But that's the way we leave it. Generally, it works. Generally, the board appoints other people who have normally some idealistic commitment to the purposes of the nonprofit. So it exists. The for-profit exists for shareholders. The nonprofit exists for whatever the charter of the nonprofit said, to promote some cause. For-profits have a price per share. Nonprofits are not traded, and so they don't have a price, no price for them.
You mentioned nonprofit organizations in your lecture, so can you talk about, does nonprofit status means that their revenues should never exceed their costs to maintain nonprofit status?
Yeah, nonprofit, maybe it's misleading. It doesn't mean that they don't make profits. It means that they don't distribute profits to shareholders. The purpose is not to distribute profits, but they do have a purpose. In a for-profit company, the objectives that are focused on are the shareholders. They take the money and they do what they want with it. But in a nonprofit, the nonprofit can make as much profits as it wants, but it keeps them in the company and spends them on some purpose. A nonprofit has to be defined with a purpose. It has, because it doesn't go any, otherwise they would just sit on the money forever. And in fact, that kind of thing has happened, where nonprofits accumulate huge amounts of money, and people wonder, where's it going to go? Where's it going to be spent? Sometimes nonprofits are developed that have a goal that gets lost later. One famous example is the Shaker Church. That was a Christian church in the 19th century, and they created a foundation and they accumulated money, but there aren't hardly any Shakers left. There might be 2 left in the world. And so the foundation is being run by people who have to think, well, what would I do if I were a Shaker? That is a potential problem with nonprofits, but usually they're defined with a purpose that will endure and will continue to motivate their use of the profits. So now I wanted to make a very basic point about corporations and shares. If I give you 1,000 shares in a company, and you wonder, well, what does that mean, that I own 1,000 shares? You have to ask another question, which is, how many shares are there outstanding? So we talked about this before. I'm not up to date on these, but my share of the company is equal to the total number of shares I own divided by the total number of shares outstanding for the company. It's my number relative to the total. If I own half of the shares outstanding, then I own half of the company. Companies do things called splits, where they will break a share in 2 and call one share another 1.5 shares or 2 shares or whatever. They do that periodically. Why do they do that? It seems that companies think that there's an optimal price per share that encourages investors, looks right, feels right, so they will change the number of shares from time to time to try to hit a target for the price per share. In the United States, by tradition, the target price per share is something like $30 a share. So suppose your company has done very well, and the price per share, which was originally $30, is now up to $60. Your board of directors may then, someone might bring it up at the board meeting, we should do a 2-for-1 split, to get our share price back down to the magic $30 a share. So then you would then send out a letter to all of your shareholders and saying, we're doubling the number of shares. And by the way, you now have twice whatever you did before. Well, I put down on my slides, this is essentially meaningless. All they're doing is changing the unit of measurement. It's like going between metric and avoirdupois. It means nothing. So, by the way, why do they even do it? Well, why not, you know? One reason they do it is they just think if the share price gets too high, you can't buy a fraction of a share. It gets too expensive. And people like to buy in round lots because the brokers encourage that, of 100 shares. So if it's $30 a share, you can buy an investment round lot for $3,000. But it gets expensive if you don't split. Now, one company that doesn't split is Berkshire Hathaway. That's Warren Buffett's company. And it's been selling for thousands of dollars per share. So you can't even buy a round lot unless you're a substantially wealthy person. Warren Buffett does that out of some principle. He can do it. Well, I should say his board does that. They can do it because it's all meaningless, but not totally meaningless, just that it gets hard to buy small amounts of shares. You can buy one share, but you can't buy a half a share. So now the company is defined, as I said, in basic terms by a board of directors. It's in the company has a constitution called the corporate charter, and the corporate charter defines how things are done. But the general principle is guided by state laws. It's state governments that manage. You have to incorporate in a state, which means you choose a state to make your headquarters in, and that state then restricts what you can put into the corporate charter. Delaware is the most popular state for incorporating because, well, it's the smallest state in the United States, and small states have an incentive to be very generous to corporations, and then they'll all move to your state, and you'll end up making money. Big states wouldn't do that because they already have corporations who need to be there. The corporate law in a state defines the rights and responsibilities of shareholders and the board of directors. But it doesn't say, well, it might say something about dividends, but it doesn't tell the company what to pay out. Now, you buy shares, this is something that's often forgotten. You buy shares in a company to get dividends.
A dividend is a distribution of money from the company's earnings to its shareholders.
That's why, in America at least, especially, where we make it very clear, why would you buy shares in a company? Hey, they pay dividends. It's like interest, except it's variable and tends to grow through time, whereas debt contracts, it doesn't grow, it's just fixed. So you're doing it for the dividends. Some people, remember we had the return on a corporation has two components. The capital gains, which is the appreciation in the price per share, and the dividends. So people tend to talk so much about the capital gains, the movement of the market, they forget about dividends, and some people don't even know there are dividends. And so, but it's actually the whole reason for being for the stock market, ideally anyway. You buy shares to get dividends. And in fact, if you look at history, even up to recent times, most of the returns you get on the stock market are in the dividends. People think, well, no, isn't it just that the market has soared? Well, historically, over 100 years, dividends are more important. The stock market goes up and down, creates capital gains and capital losses, but dividends are what it's all about. So companies don't have to pay a dividend, but typically young companies don't. Once they're mature, they like to start paying dividends, and it signals to the world that they're really making money. If you invest in a company that never pays a dividend, you start to wonder, is this real or is this a fraud? I never get a penny from them. So once they're into making money, they think it impresses investors to get dividend checks. I remember my own company. We incorporated in Delaware, my first company, Shiller Weiss Incorporated, and we didn't have to pay a dividend. I remember we had a board meeting where we talked about exactly this. And you know, we've never paid a dividend. We gave shares to a lot of our employees as incentive, but they don't even, someone said, they don't even believe in it. You know, nothing has ever happened. So we should pay a dividend. But we didn't. We held on. The employees eventually did well when we sold the company. They found out that their shares really were worth something. But we should have started paying dividends to make it clearer. We didn't. So when a company pays a dividend, what happens to the share price? Well, very simple. It drops because the company used to have the money and now it doesn't. It paid it out. The share price pretty much has to drop. I don't suppose it always does because funny things happen. But the basic idea is that a share drops in value when a dividend is paid. But I have to qualify that. It doesn't drop in value when you get the check in the mail for your dividend. That would be variable anyway, right? They don't necessarily pay them out at the any exact moment. So a company has to define what they call an ex-dividend date. That means they will pay out the dividend, this dividend, typically quarterly dividends every 3 months. They'll pay out this dividend to shareholders of record on this date. So company values drop routinely on the ex-dividend date. That doesn't mean bad news about the company at all.
So I had a question about companies and different dividend payment systems. So some companies like to boast about they always pay dividends, they never miss it. And why would they want to emphasize this? And then what would happen if they have to cut back on their dividends or they don't miss their dividends in a period?
Well, I think this is an essentially behavioral human question. So the reason they don't want to miss a dividend is because they think that will harm the investor support. And they don't want to see their stock price fall. If the investors lose confidence in the company, the stock price can fall, and then the management starts to worry that they'll be taken over. If the price gets too low, takeover people will think, I'll buy it and I'll shut it down and sell off all their assets, maybe. You could get, if it gets low enough. So it's a big fear. They don't want investors to have a bad attitude. So then why would you as an investor be disturbed if a company didn't pay a dividend? Well, I think it's a sort of fundamental human mistrust. You don't know that these guys are on the level. You know, maybe they're crooks or maybe they're not. It's like missing a payment on your credit card. You know, you have a credit rating that depends on your actually making these monthly payments. And you could take the attitude, well, I'll miss it once in a while. I'll pay it up, you know, I'll pay the fine. What difference does it make? But your credit rating will go down if you do that. So most people personally think, I'm going to pay every month. This is something I'm really going to do. And they kind of imagine that it's like that with dividends, that the company, if they miss a dividend, it means they're kind of unreliable, untrustworthy. Now, they didn't have to think that, but that apparently is how a lot of people think. So that's why lots of companies don't ever want to miss paying a dividend.
Couldn't missing a dividend also be a real indication of financial trouble, though, and maybe that's why investors have why a red flag is raised?
Yeah. No, the thing is that a dividend is not promised. The corporate law says that they can pay a dividend at the discretion of the board, whether they want to or not. And many companies go years without paying dividends. But the public might have some preconceived notions and think it's like my credit card bill, and if they're not paying, yeah, there's something wrong here. Now, they could stop paying a dividend for perfectly good reasons, like they want to do something with it more productive, but the investors might not understand. By the way, I don't mean that firms never miss paying a dividend. I'm just saying that some firms pride themselves on never having missed a dividend. I've already suggested, but I didn't really state it clearly, the difference between common and preferred stock. We've been talking about common stock. Now, common doesn't mean plain and not pretty. It means held in common. It's The word equity refers to common stock as well. I'll come back to that. What's the difference? Preferred stock has a specified dividend which does not grow through time. And like common stock, it doesn't have to be paid. Now, again, there might be slight differences in state law. We have 50 different states in the United States, and other countries have similar institutions. There's a complicated law. But typically, the deal is this. The company is supposed to pay out a fixed dividend to the preferred stockholders, but it doesn't have to. But it cannot pay a common stock dividend until it's paid up on its preferred stock dividends. So if they don't pay them, then they have to, if they haven't paid their preferred dividends, they've got to make it up eventually. But in contrast, corporate bonds have a contractual obligation to pay a dividend. So that is that if the company gets in trouble and it doesn't, as I say dividend, a coupon on the bond. If the company gets in trouble and doesn't pay out its coupon, the shareholders can come back and sue, force the company into bankruptcy. Preferred stockholders can't do that. Otherwise, they're kind of like corporate bonds. During the financial crisis, 2000, 2008, 2009, 2000, the U.S. government got a lot of preferred shares in companies for bailing them out. The U.S. government didn't want to get common shares. It wanted to get paid back. It didn't want to push them into bankruptcy by creating a new form of debt. So the U.S. government got preferred stock in the company. Why didn't they get common stock? Hey, this is America. The U.S. government, if it were to be buying common stock, this would be socialism. The government would be owning parts of companies, and they didn't want to do that. So they bought preferred stock. So for example, the U.S. government had, and the Canadian government, I think, had a lot of preferred shares in General Motors. Now, the basic corporate charter emphasizes that all common shareholders are treated equally. They don't have to pay out dividends to them, but if they do pay out dividends, it has to be every share gets the same, and that's where the word equity comes in. It's equality of shareholders. Does not have to pay dividends. The board decides. Doesn't ever have to pay dividends. But you trust that the board will pay dividends because the other shareholders want the money. They can't get at it without paying you too. The firm can also repurchase shares instead of paying a dividend. No law saying that they have to. They can both issue new shares and they can repurchase shares. The board decides. There's also other kinds of corporate liabilities. Warrants, which are a form of option, convertible debt. They can do whatever they want. But the fundamental thing that ties it down is that all shareholders have one vote, and they elect the board. Now, there were critics of shareholder democracy. Notably, Burley and Means wrote a book in 1933 that was very influential, arguing that, well, you've described a system of corporate governance that sounds plausible and probably does work for little companies, but it might not work for big companies. Well, I know when I set up my own little company, Case Shiller Weiss, there were 3 of us and we got some more, well, we had one more major shareholder. We got together and it was very clear that we voted and things happened because we were involved. So the democracy, it just seemed perfectly natural and functional. But Burley and Means thought that it doesn't work so well for big companies. The same reason maybe why voting when there are millions of people voting doesn't work so well. So I don't know what you think. Do you vote? I mean, as you go to the voting booth in an election, does it ever occur to you that my vote doesn't matter unless the rest of the people are equally tied, right? If exactly half vote for one candidate and exactly half vote for the other candidate, then it's tied, and my vote would decide. Okay? Otherwise, my vote doesn't do anything. So what's the probability that my vote is the deciding vote? Well, if there's millions of people, the probability it must be, minuscule. So if you're really rational, you wouldn't vote. But people still vote in elections, and this must be out of some sort of patriotic feeling or sense of obligation. But when it comes to corporations, those senses aren't so, you don't feel patriotic for a corporation. So, and a corporation has an election, why do I even bother? We're holding diversified portfolios, aren't we? So I've got 100 different stocks. I can't keep up with how they're all being managed, and would go to an election and vote my share. I'm only a tiny, tiny fraction, so why should I do that? So Burley and Means said that while in practice we have shareholder democracy, in practice the democracy is imperfect. It's really self-perpetuating boards of directors. So that led, their book was extremely important historically. And what it led to is new regulation that tried to allow for takeovers of companies. What Burley and Means said is a lot of companies were ill-managed and managed for the interests of the board of directors because they just effectively owned the corporate. They can't pay themselves big amounts of money. They can put fairly generous salaries. They can hire their friends and give them nice jobs. They're sort of ripping off the company. The shareholders, some of them might hear about this and get upset, but it's hopeless. You can't influence the votes of so many people. So they made it easier. In 1935, the Securities and Exchange Commission, under authority of the act that had just created it in 1934, established rules for proxy contests so that people who wanted to change the governance of the company could reach the shareholders and ask them to sign a contract to let you vote on my behalf. You would give them the right to be a proxy for you at the shareholders meeting. They made it, the companies didn't want to help outsiders reach their shareholders. They wouldn't publish the list of shareholders. So that there was no way that a proxy contest could have been done prior to 1935. But now they made it because they began to think, we have to make shareholder democracy work. This is Roosevelt era, which was very left-wing. But the really wonderful thing about the Roosevelt New Deal was that it wasn't socialist. It was maybe motivated by social harmony and concern about poor people, but it left intact the corporation. So this doesn't sound like Franklin Delano Roosevelt at all, but it is. It's trying to make democracy work, and they wanted shareholder democracy to work, so that there have to be election contests in corporations like we see in politics. In 1956, amendments made proxy contests difficult, but then people later, as we moved to a more free market governance, relaxed the 1956 amendment so that proxy contests came back. Now, some companies have classes of shares as permitted by state law. So you can have both voting and non-voting shares. Berkshire Hathaway, which is the company of Warren Buffett, who has both Class A shares that have voting rights and Class B shares do not. I don't know if I have to update this, what the Class A shares sell for now. It was recently $200,000 a share, showing, again, the fact that that doesn't mean this is a big company. It only means they don't split. And it would be $30 a share if they split like other countries. And it wouldn't make the company any less valuable. Maybe I'm overstressing that. The New York Times has both Class A shares and Class B. Class A has less voting rights than Class B, which allows the descendant of the original Adolph Oaks family still to control the company. Why do they do that? Well, they think that the New York Times serves a higher purpose. That is, it's not out for profits. It has some profits, but not entirely. So they gave the original New York Times family more voting rights than the other shareholders. This has been under criticism recently, but still is maintained. Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg recently, I don't know what the percent is right now, but had 28% of its shares, but 57% of its voting shares, which means basically Mark does whatever he wants. He has the majority of votes in the, but that's because of the classes of shares. So now, how do companies raise money? You're in a company and you're trying to make a profit. You need money, say, to build a new factory or to launch a new ad campaign. So you need the money now and you get profits later. How do you get the money? Well, there's two major ways to do it. Well, I should, maybe three. One of them is retained earnings. I'll list that first. You can wait until you've made enough money, you save it up, and then you can then you can build your new factory. That's one way. But it's slow because you have to wait until you've got the retained earnings to do that. Often young companies don't have much earnings because they're putting everything into the future. Another thing you can do is borrow money, either through banks. You can go to a bank and say, I'd like a loan for my company. Or you can issue debt and sell that through a broker. You would issue a corporate bond, which brings in money. And you can issue shares, new shares. So, so suppose there are 1 million shares outstanding. You can issue another 1 million shares. Now, the shareholders of the company, when you do that, are going to look at that and say, wait a minute, what are we doing here? I used to own like 10% of the company, and now I own only 5%. So I'm not so sure I'm happy about that. But then you on the board would say, but don't worry, we brought in millions of dollars and you own a share of that, so the company has more now. So it's not bad for you. We need the money because we need to invest. And I think people understand that. So this is called dilution. When they issue more shares, your share in the company goes down, defined as the total of shares you have divided by total shares. So do you feel happy or not? Well, you have to understand that it's diluted you. You no longer have the same vote that you used to have. You've given up some voting power in order to get money to expand the company. You might come to a shareholder or a shareholders meeting and complain, but they'll say, but look, this is the way it works. We can't expand without money. And this will make you rich. You'll be treated equally to these other guys that came in and bought new shares. So you might well back down. I guess that's the way, all these big companies did that. So that if you're an initial shareholder, you once owned a big fraction of the company. It keeps going down, but the company keeps going up in value. Well, here's why they call it equity. Because all common shareholders are equal. Now, so what about issuing shares to get money? Well, some people said that issuing shares isn't very important anymore. That companies, when they need money, they borrow money or they use retained earnings. Karl Marx thought that. He said, all this trade in stocks is trading mostly existing shares. It doesn't bring money into the company. There's all this transaction. It's just gambling. That's what Marx said. All these people playing a game. It's only when the company issues shares that share price matters economically. And Marx thought they don't do that very much. Stuart Myers, who's a professor of finance at MIT, wrote an article in 1984 arguing that, well, I don't think he put it this way. Marx was right. I'm sure he didn't say Marx was right. but he was effectively saying that because he looked at the data and he said firms don't issue, when they first start, they issue a lot of shares, but after that, they're not issuing very much. So he said, he proposed what he called the pecking order theory of corporate finance. How do corporations, this sounds like behavioral economists. Now, he might shudder if I identify him as a behavioral economist, but this is what this sounds like to me. The best way to raise money for corporate actions, according to what he said boards think, is retained earnings. You feel most comfortable. You go to a board meeting and say, we need to build a new factory, but we've been making a lot of money and we've got all this cash lying around. We'll use our retained earnings to build a new company. That feels really good going into the board. They'll say, well, why not? You know, they'll go for that. But then if you say, let's go to the bank and borrow money, then they get a little nervous because bankers sometimes ask for the money back and then you can be in trouble. So that they're not quite so willing. So that's lower on the pecking order. But then the other thing you can say, all right, let's issue new shares. Now they get really creepy. Now they're thinking, oh, my vote's going down. I don't like that. Often shareholders are on the board. They're thinking, now I'm going to be giving up power to other people. And if our profits don't go up, then we're going to be dividing them up among more people. So they don't like that. So Stuart Meyer's article was very influential because it sounded right. That this sounds like the way I could imagine myself behaving as a board member. And he showed statistics emphasizing that. Now, as of 1984, most firms had not done a single equity offering in the last 20 years. And when asked, are you thinking of issuing new shares, did not even contemplate doing it. From the years 1973 to 1982, 62% of capital expenditures came from retained earnings. That is what companies were doing at that time. And only 6% from issuance of new shares. So if they never issue new shares, then what difference does the share price mean anyway to corporate activities? This was Marx was right conclusion. But they were criticized, notably Eugene Fama and Ken French. This is the Eugene Fama that we keep talking about, the efficient markets guy. But I think they were right here. Stuart Meyer's choice of 1973 to 82 was atypical. The stock market crashed in 1973, and it was still low. So you didn't get much money for the new shares you issued. Of course, nobody issued new shares. But even so, there was some forms of equity issuance even in that period. For example, they issued corporate shares to employees as a compensation, or they had warrants on the stock that were given to employees. So there was some issuance even then. But the amount of equity issuance increased right after. Well, they give 86% of firms issued some equity between 1993 and 2002. So it's really not true. Marx wasn't really right about this. The price of a share in the public market matters for the amount of money that a company can raise. So if the market price goes up, the company can get more money by issuing shares. And that encourages them to do that and make more investments. When the stock market goes down, the company starts looking at it. Typically, the board members are still optimistic about the company. And you say, we're down to $3 a share. You might be talking about doing a reverse split to try to bring it up. But you're thinking, are we selling these shares for only $3? I had my life's dreams. We're going to be diluted down for just $3? I don't believe that. And wouldn't do that. Sometimes companies will issue a dividend in shares. It's called a stock dividend. So you might get a letter from your broker saying, congratulations, the company has now paid a stock dividend of 5%. So you had 100 shares, you now have 105 shares. and a price per share is $30. So this is you've got 5 new shares. It's like getting a dividend of $150. Well, that's what most people think. But then what is the next question you ask your broker? Let me get this straight. The company has issued new shares so that I can be paid a dividend in shares, and I now have 105 shares. Is that the same as getting $150 in cash? Think about it. The question you would ask your broker, do you see where I'm going with this? The question you'd ask your broker is, wait a minute, every shareholder is getting these share dividends. It's equity. They can't pay me a stock dividend without paying the other. So the total number of shares went up by 5%. So I'm calculating what fraction of the company I own. It's the same. So then you would go to the company and say, what is this nonsense? You're paying a dividend in shares. I figured out that means nothing. The company would be kind of embarrassed if you asked that question. They would say, what would they say? They might say, if you could get them on the phone, say, yes, you are diluted. You did get shares and you were diluted down by the same amount. But we think this price per share will hold and it's going to be good for you. They'll just try to talk their way out of it. Typically, they issue stock dividends as it's kind of a trick. This is fishing for fools. But they could be well motivated in doing it. They have to keep your morale up. Maybe they weren't going to pay a cash dividend, so let's do a stock dividend. Let's make a public statement that the company is doing really well. And if anyone brings up dilution, you say, well, but we're doing so well. We don't think we wouldn't issue a stock dividend if we thought that it would make price per share fall. So people might say, okay, I can do that. Now, there was a time once when the Internal Revenue Service proposed taxing stock dividends. Well, why not? You just got a dividend. You should declare it on your taxes. So some companies went running to the IRS, and now they explained it with perfect clarity to the tax collector. No, you got to understand, this isn't really a dividend. This is just paper or something. You can't possibly tax them on this because they didn't get anything. So the IRS backed down. It doesn't tax stock dividends.
You just briefly alluded to how some firms never pay dividends or to go many years without paying them. Why do these firms think it's optimal to do so when these other firms boast about always paying dividends?
Well, typically, the firms that never pay a dividend are young firms in a rapidly growing business where they tell investors, it's a different kind of investor. The one that buys stocks that have never missed paying a dividend, that's grandma, okay, and grandpa. They don't want to, they have old-fashioned ideas. But young people are more likely to buy a stock that doesn't pay a dividend. It's also especially popular in the last 20 or 30 years. That's a long time for you, I know, but when the internet started building up steam in the 1990s, they were setting up companies like Amazon and was Google. I'm not sure about the years, but around that time, a lot of young companies were set up. And people said, this is an opportunity. Right now, there's this revolution in the internet. You've got to jump on it because it's going to go to the first mover. And to a significant extent, that's true. So the kind of people who would invest in some startup internet company back then would say, don't pay me a dividend. I want you to move. Otherwise, you'll be a loser. So in fact, it almost became reversed, that companies prided themselves on never paying a dividend. It used to be that the New York Stock Exchange wouldn't list a company that never paid a dividend. And it was prestigious to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange. But there was this other young exchange called NASDAQ that would list you whether you've paid a dividend or not. So Microsoft went on NASDAQ, not on the New York Stock Exchange. Then years later, when Microsoft became big and important, the New York Stock Exchange said, in its dignity, it said, we have now decided that Microsoft is okay for listing on the New York Stock Exchange. But you know what Bill Gates did? He said, no way, I don't care about your prestige. NASDAQ is better because it's the go for it companies. So you're right, there's different subcultures, some which appreciate a dividend and some which think it's a sign that you're old school. But you know, firms have clientele, investors that invest in their firm. And so you appeal to your clientele. The old utility companies are never going to get the young hotshot investors anyway. Now, share repurchase is another thing that happens, that instead of issuing new shares to raise money, the company can repurchase shares outstanding, go out on the market like you, and the company buys back its own shares. That's the reverse of dilution, because the number of shares goes down, and if you didn't tender your shares, if you didn't pay, if you didn't sell your shares at the time of the share repurchase, you own the same number of shares. That means your share repurchase pushes up the amount that you own of the company. So share repurchase, in a sense, is like paying a dividend. It's an alternative way of paying a dividend. So let's think of it hypothetically. Imagine that the company is about to pay its dividend. It's been paying, $2 a quarter regularly per share, and they're about to pay it. Then someone says, why don't we send out a different letter this time? Instead of saying this is a dividend, let's send a letter that says this $2 is repurchasing 1% of your shares. Of course, everyone gets the same letter. So if you get this in a minute, you would say, what's this? I got my $2 dividend check, and I also get a letter saying this is share repurchase. And now you might be confused. Well, what does this mean? Well, I tell you, one thing it means is it's not taxed because, well, not taxed the same. But forget about taxes for the minute. What does it mean whether I get a letter saying this is a share repurchase or this is a dividend? It's $2. And the share repurchase, if it's everyone equal, it doesn't affect the fraction of the company that I own. So the letter is nonsense. It's just the same thing as paying a dividend. They do a lot of share repurchases, especially recently. It's been a big thing in America since the financial crisis. Now, some people say that's because the stock market, it was during the financial crisis, the stock market was low, and so companies were buying back their shares at a low price. That's what was said. But now prices are way back up again, and companies are still repurchasing their shares. So what's going on here? There's a lot of share repurchases lately. Why do they do this? It's been 2% of shares per year, which is comparable to the dividend rate. The rate of dividends on the aggregate U.S. stock market has been something like 2%. So how do they get that? Well, the important thing is, it would seem the important thing, is there's a tax break. If they do share repurchase instead of dividends, it's the same thing in technically, but you see the tax, you can fool the IRS. Suppose the company pays out a $2 dividend, and then I would get $2 in dividends, and I would have to pay income taxes on those. It used to be you had to pay them at your marginal tax rate. Now it's 15% or it's capped at 15% of the dividends paid. But if they do share repurchase, now if I would still have $2 more, if I didn't participate in selling my shares to the company, then my value of my shares goes up by something like $2. But I don't have to pay taxes on it because I don't have to pay taxes until I sell. So I can postpone them, maybe indefinite. Maybe I'll never pay taxes on them. So I like that. I like share repurchases. Now, incidentally, right now in the United States, the capital gains tax for small capital gains is capped at 15% also. But for higher amounts, it's 20%. The real thing, though, that's different is that capital gains taxes don't have to be, that's for long-term capital gains. Capital gains taxes do not have to be paid until you sell the shares. So it allows you to postpone, maybe for the rest of your life, you know, the tax on the amount paid out. So there's a tax incentive for share repurchase rather than dividends. I think that is a substantial part of the reason why companies are relying more on share repurchase. There's other issues, though. These are behavioral finance. One thing is that people just don't get it. Most people have not taken financial markets, and they don't understand what's going on. So if you were to say, we're not paying dividends anymore, and we're going to do share repurchase instead. First of all, you get the IRS. If you do it every quarter, if you do share repurchase every quarter and you make this big announcement, the IRS will then say, maybe this is a dividend, even though you're calling it. You got to be devious about it. You can't do it every quarter. But suppose you did that. The people would react immediately to the loss of dividend. I'm talking about grandma and grandpa who are retired and don't know anything about finance. If they got a letter saying, we're canceling your dividend, they would panic. They say, well, we have a rule that we only live off of interest and dividends. We can't, they'd be upset. And some companies boast that they have always paid a dividend. This is very effective for grandma and grandpa, who often have a rule that I never dip into the principal, I only live off income. And I need that to buy food every quarter, so I need those dividends. I mean, you could tell them, no, you don't. You can sell your shares. Anytime you need, sell some of your shares. And they're going up in value because of the repurchase. But they won't get it. There's also other thing about a price pop after repurchase that might encourage share repurchase. What does the stock market value? What is, now, as I said last time, a lot of people think the stock market, you buy into the stock market so that it goes up and you can sell at a higher price. But what is it? What are you pricing? Well, some people have never thought about that. They just want to know whether it goes up. So what I was saying last period, I repeat it, that most of the return people have gotten historically from stocks is in dividends, not in capital gains. And in fact, it's correct to think that efficient markets implies that what you're really pricing in the stock market is a claim on dividend. That's why if a company were to, suppose a company were to say, we will never pay a dividend again, and we're going to put it into our charter that we will never pay a dividend. All of our profits go to charity, let's say. Well, you can do that, but what's the value of a share? Well, there are no shares, but I mean, if there were, they'd be meaningless, so they'd be worth nothing. So it's all about dividends. There's two important ratios. There's the price-earnings ratio, price per share divided by earnings per share, and there's the price-dividend ratio, or typically dividend-price ratio, where it's dividends per share divided by price per share. Now, let's simplify things and not worry about that distinction. Suppose a company is paying out all of its earnings as dividends. Then the two are the same. So let's just talk about the price-earnings ratio. What does that mean? It's different for different companies. Some have a high price-earnings ratio. It could be as high as 100. That's very unusual, which would mean that you'd have to wait 100 years to get your money back based on dividends. If you bought it, that's a long time to wait. More typically, the price-earnings ratio is something like 15. So you'd buy a share, and in 15 years, if you're getting all the earnings as dividends, you'd have your money back. So the price-earnings ratio should be something like that, like 15, right? 10, 15, 20, not 100. You wouldn't buy into an investment that takes 100 years to pay out. So what determines the price-earnings ratio? Well, I referred to the idea that efficient markets idea is that the price of a share is the present discounted value of its expected future dividends. And then I can apply the Gordon rule, which I mentioned recently, which says the price should be equal to earnings divided by R minus G, where R is the interest rate or discount rate, and G is the growth rate of earnings. So the price-earnings ratio is 1 over R minus G. Now this is a very important model because it gives you a theory, it's an efficient markets theory, why some firms have high price-earnings ratio and other firms have low price-earnings ratio. It all has to do with R and G. Those are the only things that go into this formula. So if a company has a low price-earnings ratio, according to efficient markets, according to this I should say, efficient markets is not precisely defined. There are many different efficient markets models. But I'm taking the sort of basic canonical present value model of efficient markets. And it would say if a company has low PE, that means either R is high for that company or G is low for that company, or both, or a combination of both. Now, why would R be high for a company? Well, if you believe the standard theory, which has been taught for 50 years in finance courses, we have the security markets line. Remember, the expected return on a stock is a function of its covariance with the market. So that would mean that companies whose return covaries with the market should tend to have, via this R thing, should have low price-earnings ratios. They're, in simple terms, they're riskier in the correct sense that CAPM provides. They're riskier in that they covary with the market. Okay. The other thing, though, is G. Some companies have very high growth prospects. Everyone knows that they're good. They have some patent, say, or some good technology. Nobody can compete with them. They're just starting out. Of course you expect their earnings to grow. But in efficient markets, that's not a reason to invest in them because the price will reflect the growth in earnings already. So it will already be discounted into the present value. So anyway, high growth companies should tend to have high PE. A low PE would be a low growth company. There are often good reasons for a low price earnings ratio. One is that the business is very risky, and so people don't want to put a lot of money into it. And another one is that the business might have a poor earnings growth outlook, that earnings is likely to fall. The classic example of that is railroads. That was the in thing in the 19th century. By the early 20th century, it was looking a little bit old-fashioned. And we've gone another 100 years. So they're really not the most rapidly growing investment. So they get beaten down. The price gets beaten down. But you know what? Railroads are here to stay, and there's always a price that makes them a good investment. So when were railroads a good investment? Well, I was thinking around 2000, when the market was at a peak, what I call the millennium peak, and it was all this internet .com stuff. You shouldn't have been buying .com then, usually. You should have been buying railroads because they were just forgotten at the time. The question is, does it work? Does the efficient markets model work? Well, I've been always saying that efficient markets is a half-truth. And it sort of half works, especially with G. As I say, railroads are not high PE stocks. But there's another approach to investing, which goes back many years, called value investing. Okay. Notably, Benjamin Graham and David Dodd, who were teaching finance at Columbia University in the 1930s, they wrote a textbook called Securities Analysis. And in that textbook, they outlined their thought that, PE varies for other reasons than just this technical reason that we talked about. Because companies go in and out of fashion. And when they're hot, people bid them up too high. And then when they're ignored, they just ignore them and forget about them, and they get low PEs. So value investing, as outlined in 1934 by Graham and Dodd, is still with us. And it still works, although it hasn't worked in the last 5 years. It comes and goes, but generally it has worked. This is going to apply also to real estate, but let me just move on to, this is a figure from the third edition, Irrational Exuberance, that you have. And it gives some sense of value investing. The thin black line is the stock price. It's the S&P 500 index, corrected for inflation, back to 1996. And the solid black line is a tabulation of a questionnaire item I've had on, I've been doing since 1996. So I started doing surveys, actually I started in the 1980s, doing surveys of investors. These are individual investors, high income, I mean income like 200,000. I figure those are more representative of the stock market. I didn't want to, I like low income people, but I don't survey them when asking about the stock market. So the question was, do you agree with the following statement? Stocks are the best investment for long-term holders who can buy and hold through the ups and downs of the market. I'd heard that phrase said so many times in 1996 that I thought, you know, I better start tabulating. Do people believe that? Now, this theory is not what we say in this course. This course emphasizes diversification and not looking for the best investment. But I just want to know what people think. To my amazement, almost everybody thought that's right. Stocks are the best investment. So you can see in the year 2000, which I have marked up here, it was something like 95% of these people thought stocks are the best investment. Now there could be a little of a bias. These are people who agreed to fill out my questionnaire. They must have found it interesting, so it may not be completely accurate, but it's certainly an awfully high proportion. I almost don't believe results like this. It was really into the culture that smart people invest in the stock market. But you notice the stock market had been rising for years prior to that. And this is the millennium, the peak of what I call in the book, the millennium bubble. This is the new millennium. And then we celebrated the new millennium. It was great. Do you remember it? Probably not very well. And look what the stock market did right after it. And then look what happened to opinions about stocks are the best investment right after it. Came down with it. The stock market bottomed out, so did their agreement with that. Now, it's not a perfect fit, but I see a strong parallel. This inclines me to value investing. This question didn't ask about, do you think the stock market will go up next year or the next 2 years? It's about stocks are the best investment. It's like timeless. So why should opinions about something so timeless be so variable through time? And why are they so influenced by the recent behavior of the market? Well, I think that's human psychology and behavioral economics. Now this comes back to the funny question that we discussed previously, that last period. Almost all the value of the stock inherently is due to the dividends. But firms don't even have to pay dividends, and they often go through years and years without paying dividends. The other thing is, and we have to be clear about this, firms can get money to their shareholders in another way besides paying dividends. You can buy back shares. And firms do that. It's the same thing. We talked about that, right? The dividends are, you could send a letter with your dividend check and say, well, we're really buying back shares. And it wouldn't make any difference, except to the IRS, who might decide something different about taxation. But there are other reasons why firms pay dividends. And Hirsch-Sheffrin and Meyer-Statman described what they called a self-control theory of dividend. Now this sounds funny, but there's a lot of people who invest in stocks and have a personal rule of thumb that I will never dip into principal. The modal investor in the stock market in the United States is a 80-year-old woman. Well, I'm exaggerating, not quite 80 years old, a widow. And sometimes they are following the instructions of their late husband, who said, never dip into principal. That's for the grandchildren. Never touch it. But if dividends go to zero, she's in trouble. She doesn't have any income. Now, this sounds really silly, but it actually applies even to such institutions as Yale University, who a half century to a century ago, I think was influenced by the same thinking. So we wanted dividend-paying stocks, and we didn't want to touch the principal. That all changed when we got David Swensen to take over and became a more sophisticated investment manager. Another theory why firms, something that influences their thinking about dividend by Bhattacharya, Hackinson, and Ross, is that they use dividends to prove to the public that they're really worth something. And how it's called a signaling theory is a theory that you do something not for its intrinsic value, but because it proves something about you. So Michael Spence, who used to be dean at at Harvard College, surprisingly wrote a famous article saying college educations are largely signaling. This sounds awfully cynical from the dean, but he did say that why do you go to college? You want to prove two things. You're smart and you're not mentally ill, all right? And you can actually slog through all this nonsense that you get in college and you make it out 4 years later. And so I think there's some truth to this. I hope that's not the only reason you go to college. But you actually have to do, why go through all 4? Why don't you do a Bill Gates and drop out? You already proved that you could get into Harvard. Why don't you just drop out? Well, you might, if you're an entrepreneur, just drop out because you don't have to prove anything to anyone. But you want to stay the whole 4 years because that separates you from the people who are unstable and who can't hack the work. So you're proving your work ethic. Well, I'm not saying that's right. That's a signaling theory. Well, it's the same idea that Bhattacharya, Hackinson, and Ross have, that firms are signaling. Life is filled with signaling. You're trying to prove one thing or another by doing something. And so firms pay dividends just to show there's real money here. We've really got it. And if we were on the verge of bankruptcy, we wouldn't do this, obviously, because we would be risking going under. So it's a proof that we're there. We've made it. And I'm sure there's some truth to that. But this kind of signaling does impose taxes. Remember, dividends are subject to immediate income taxes, whereas repurchase of shares will not involve any tax until you sell the thing again, sell the shares again. John Lintner was a professor at Harvard Business School who said that he interviewed a lot of firms about dividends and how they decide. This is unusual for in the efficient markets era when he was writing. Usually, you never interview anyone. You just trust to markets, and so no one can tell you why they do things. But he interviewed people who set dividend policy for firms and asked them how they did it. And he found that they said all sorts of things. But he said, and the bottom line is they just gradually adjust dividends toward earnings per share. So they have some target payout ratio. I was assuming above it was 1. They were paying out all their earnings. But in fact, it's less than 1 typically. And so they change the dividends only slightly each quarter, reflecting an adjustment towards the target dividend price ratio. So you can see that the tau, the target ratio times EPS, is the dividends they would have with today's earnings per share. And if it's above their previous dividends, they'll raise dividends, but not enough to put it there. That's because earnings jump around. And another thing they told Lintner, we don't like to cut dividends. We never want to cut them. That's embarrassing. People start calling us up and said, last quarter you sent me a check for this and this. I need the money. Why are you cutting it? And you'd have to tell some story. Well, you know, our earnings weren't as good as we thought. You don't want to tell a story like that. So when earnings jump up, you don't raise your dividends right away. You lag behind. And that's what the Lintner model says. Just to give you some idea, though, that back in 1968, General Public Utilities Corp., which was a utilities company, proposed to substitute stock dividends for cash dividends, and offered to sell the stock sell the stock dividend to the stockholder for minimal costs. And I wrote a letter to the shareholders saying this would save them $4 million a year in taxes. He's saying, instead of paying a dividend, we decided to buy back some of your shares. So you now have less shares, but you get the same check. And you're going to get the same checks in the future because everybody's shares went down. He explained all this, and they didn't get it. He was just trying to save them on taxes. But you know what happened? He got death threats. People, you know, investors are emotional. And somehow they didn't like the sound of this. It sounded immoral. Cash in on principle, you're selling our shares. We don't want to sell our shares, we just want the money. And it just lost on them. You know, people don't think about taxes. Even high-income people who might own shares, which goes to show why I don't really believe in efficient markets. It's somewhat true, but there's a lot of people out there who don't think very much about investing, and it's such a complicated thing to imagine that the market gets it right. Now, on the other hand, efficient markets is still valuable because there's still a lot of smart money. They just don't completely dominate. There is a lot of smart money that will take advantage of mispricing. But they do it at some risk, and it's not a sure thing. And so they hold back a little bit, and there are mispricings all over.